We're going to take a look at paper. Paper is very important, obviously, to the print production process. It is what your pixels on screen on paper and into your client's hands. So it's a tactile, real experience for clients to feel the paper. We're going to look at the paper making process real quick. We're going to then talk about the different types of paper, some of the qualities you need to know, and choosing papers with your print sales representative. So, as you know, paper is made mainly from trees. There are other sources of paper, sources of fiber to make papers, such as linen, cottons, hemp, bamboo, etc. But essentially, the paper making process is pretty similar for all of them. And it starts by chipping up the tree into very fine chips where it gets mixed with water and chemicals into a pulp mixture. Chemical pulping breaks down the chips into tiny fibers. And so those fibers get stirred and mixed together into a slurry, and it gets bleached, cleaned, and bleached so it becomes white. And then that slurry is laid out over these large screens, which lets the water drain away from it and keeps the fibers back. And the fibers will eventually dry and the water gets pressed out of it on these big rollers to dry them out and form them into sheets and rolls. During that process of the rollers, they can apply different effects to them. They can put textures on them, they can coat them, they can tint them with color so they can color the paper. And so a variety of things happen at this point where the paper's not completely done yet. It's still a little wet, but it's mainly dry and it's almost a finished product. So coating and coloring and texturing paper happens, and then it finally gets put onto these giant rolls, and the rolls get slit down into smaller rolls, but they're still quite large, and then the rolls can be delivered, or they can be cut into sheets right there. So here's a picture, some pictures of paper on the rolls. You can see the top left corner. There's an enormous roll coming off of the paper making machinery. That giant roll gets cut into smaller rolls, but they're still quite large, as you can see below and over to the right. The rolls, I've seen those working in print shops where the paper is rolled. They'll be stacked 4 or 5 rolls high, which is kind of daunting when you're walking through and you're hoping that they're not going to fall over. But rolls of paper can be used directly onto a press, which is called a web press. And a web press just has a roll of paper at one end that gets fed in to the press and goes through all the printing cylinders. And when it comes out, and there's a cutter at the end which cuts it into the sheets and gets sheeted at the end. Or the roll can be put onto what's called a sheeter, which is just a machine that takes the roll and cuts it up into sheets. It cuts it into standard sheet sizes. And then you take those sheets and you feed those sheets into a sheet-fed press. So basically, we're going to look at some generic types of paper. This is very generic, but you have a bond paper. There's a text. It's called text paper, or also called book paper. And then cover papers. These are your basic papers. Bond paper is mainly used for business paper. Your photocopy paper is considered a bond paper. Um, Text paper is a little higher quality, and it's mainly used for running in presses, like offset presses, um, for creating your basic magazines, books. Most of the paper that you've seen printed is a text paper, and that can come coated or uncoated, different colors and textures and so on. And then these are general terms. These are generic general terms. The cover paper is basically a thicker stock to protect the pages, um, and covers can be coated or uncoated. So when we look at paper samples, we'll be looking at these basic types of text and cover papers for commercial printing. Coated versus uncoated. So as I mentioned in the paper making process, the paper gets coatings applied to it. And if you look at this graphic over to the left, the blue square, at the bottom of that, there's a cross section of paper that's uncoated. And so you can see the rough paper fibers. It's just simulated, the diagram, that the paper fibers are rough, but as you apply coatings, the coatings fills in the little valleys there, and it becomes more and more smooth as you apply more and more coating to it. So uncoated to something a little less coated might create a satiny paper, compared to a fully coated glossy paper at the top of that diagram there. Some of the differences between glossy and coated and uncoated papers is how the ink lands on the paper. So when it lands on a uncoated paper, and if you look over to the right, there's a comparison between uncoated and coated papers. So the uncoated paper, the ink gets absorbed into the fibers of the paper more compared to the glossy paper, which has a coating which makes the ink sit more on top of the paper. So a result of that is that you have brighter colors because the ink is up on top of the paper, not being absorbed by the fibers, and you have sharper images, especially when it comes to text or black and white lines. You'll have sharp lines. You'll have a sharper edge to your images. And then there's a little microscopic view of the coated versus uncoated. So overall, coated papers are going to have colors that pop, that are brighter colors, shinier, and with sharper edges, sharper images. So another factor to consider is paper weight, the thickness of the paper. The thickness of the paper is generally referred to as weight. And there's two ways that it's mainly calculated and talked about. So that as a print salesperson might be talking to you about paper, they're going to say, well, we're going to looking at an 80-pound paper or a 50-pound paper. And you might be thinking, what does that mean? Well, when they say a 50-pound paper or 80-pound paper or 100-pound paper, they're talking about the way that the paper is measured and through the weight. And that's generally a formula where they take 500 sheets of the paper, and it's of a base sheet size. So if it's cover paper, it's going to be 20 by 26. If it's text paper, it's 25 by 38. And then they put 500 sheets and they weigh it, and whatever the weight is what they call the weight of the paper. 80-pound paper or 80-pound or 100-pound paper, and so on. So a thicker paper is going to have more weight to it, so it's obvious, and it makes sense. You say 100-pound paper is thicker than 80-pound paper. Another way to measure paper, and that you might hear it referred to, and this is more for thicker papers, cover stocks, is by the point, and that's through a caliper. So they might say that's 10-point paper or 7-point paper, and when they say that, they're talking about the actual physical measurement of the thickness. So a caliper is a tool that's shaped like a C clamp, and it clamps very lightly onto the pen, and it measures it in thousandths of an inch. And whatever that number is becomes the point value. So 7 thousandths of an inch becomes 7-point paper, is called 7-point paper. So so yes, 10-point paper is thicker than 7-point paper. So it's logical in both instances that the higher the number, the thicker the paper. But it's just good to know that you're going to hear both of these terms and to know what they're talking about. Some other qualities of paper to consider are smoothness, whether it has texture, if it's smooth, the opacity, can you see through the paper at all? Its color or shade, if it's recycled, and grain direction. We're actually going to talk about grain direction a little bit here. So back in the paper making process, as the slurry is put onto the sheets and it's being thinned out and drained, what happens is that the fibers in the slurry will line up and orientate themselves in the same direction, and that creates a grain to the paper. A grain is important for printers because it affects how the paper is folded and how it runs through their presses. So they will take the measurement of, they will take the direction of the grain from the measurement. It's usually the second number of the measurement, so like 38 by 25 means the 25-inch side is the direction of the grain. There's different ways to tell how the grain goes, and there's these old school methods of like hanging it off a table or scratching it with your fingernails. Another one that's not shown here is just laying it flat on a table and then picking it up and trying to like bend it over one direction versus the other, and one way will give more resistance to kind of like rolling it over, and the side with more resistance is against the grain. And the main effect that has for you and for the printer is when it comes to folding, and a lot of printed material gets folded somewhere. And if you fold against the grain, it's going to crack. And so printers need to know the size of your artwork, where it's being folded, and how it's going to fit on their press sheets, and the press sheets, what the grain is. So that might limit your press sheet size, or how many they can fit up, how many copies they can put on one press sheet, and change how much paper you need to order or the size of the paper, things like that. And so we're also going to take a quick peek here at paper sizes. So there are basic paper sizes. And you ever pull up a printer and you go to pick your letter size, and then you see all these sizes like A4, A3, A5, and like you wonder what those are? Well, those are European and other countries' paper standards. So just like metric system, the United States has its own paper standards for sizes, where the rest of the world uses a whole other format. And so they go on this the A formats. So it starts with a basic size of paper, and then that's an A0. And if they cut that in half, that becomes an A1. And if you cut an A1 in half, that becomes A2 size paper. If you cut A2 in half, that becomes A3. If you cut A2 in half, that becomes A3, and so on. So there's kind of a logic and a logic to it. And the other papers, they all have different base sizes measured in millimeters. So your A papers versus your E papers versus C papers. And what it comes down to, and an interesting thing here, is that a letter size paper for us, if you look down here in the corner where I've circled in red, a letter size paper for us is different than the letter size paper for people in Europe, say. Our sheets are a little bit shorter and a little bit wider, where the European sheets are a little higher and a little skinnier. And interesting note, one time I was doing a design job for letter size paper, and I had to design for both, that it would be printed on um, European and American sizes. So I had to get the margins for both and use both margins into one design so that we could just take the one design file and have it printed on both different size papers. So looking at the North American sheet sizes, you can see we've got our standard 8.5 by 11 paper, and you know if you take that and you turn it sideways, you put two together, you get a 11 by 17. That's pretty standard. And then from there it starts to break down a little bit because you can turn the 11 by 17 sideways and fit two next to that. You'd get 17 by 22, but the actual standard is 17.5 by 22.5. And then the next sheet size up from that is a 19 by 25. That's a very common uh, printing press size paper. And your 25 by 38. That's commonly referred to as a 40-inch press. That's the paper for a 40-inch press, which are some of the largest presses. I'm not expecting you to memorize any paper sizes, but it's good to know when it comes to designing something. If you're going to design a poster that's 20 by 26, it's going to be printed on a larger sheet of paper where there's going to be a lot of waste. And so you may consider your options of making it a bigger poster or making it just a little bit smaller to get it on a smaller sheet size if possible. But just to keep your sheet size in mind, when your estimator is looking at your job, the estimator will be looking to see what size papers it can fit on because that's what they're going to have to order. Just to wrap up here, a couple of things about paper. Again, go with what your goals are for your design project. So what do you want to communicate? If you're printing for high quality sales for homes or cars or other products, you're going to want to use high quality paper. If you're just printing something that's going to be direct mail that most people are just going to throw into recycling, then you're probably not going to want to invest a lot in the paper. So what's the expected lifespan? Is it going to be a book that's going to be around for 50 years, or is it just going to be something somebody sees for a day? Or is it going to be just for a workshop? And compare the costs and the quality. You have to talk with your print shop about what is going to work best on their presses. So that'll have a big effect on quality versus cost and the satisfaction that you're going to have. Keep in mind that printing on colored paper will change the colors of your inks. White is not an ink unless you order it special. That would become a spot color. White is considered the color of the paper. So if you're printing on colored paper, you don't get any white unless you order it as a spot color, a special ink. And it'll tint any of your other colors. Generally, paper sheets are more expensive than paper on a roll. Glossy papers are more expensive than matte or uncoated papers. Wood-free paper is more expensive than wood pulp paper. Colored is more expensive than white. And your cotton fibers and rag paper is definitely not as can be more expensive than. Anyways, hope you learned something about paper today, and we'll see you next time.